going to start. Welcome to the Russian Revolution of October. We have before us and in the first row cornered the market on the Russian Revolution for books and articles. I think we are delighted this evening to present a conversation about the October Revolution, mainly in a long-run perspective, the issues that it raises. And after 50 years, I look around, and not all will agree, but I look around. Some of these guys have been around for 50 years. I have. We look through the eyes of those who are looking back, those who were powerfully impressive in that era, in the 1980s, some in the 1990s, one late 1970s, in establishing a point of view which has lasted, at least in the United States, since then. There is also a counter-revisionist point of view, and there are those here who represent foremost historians from that perspective. So I want to introduce them to you. Then I want to say the first speaker will be, of course, Yuri Petrov, who is the director of the Russian Institute of the Academy of Sciences of the Russian Federation, and the author of many books, including two I just got on the Russian Revolution, and before that, books on World War I. His microphone. Hello? Work it? Does it work? Great. So in the immediate post-war era, in the West and in Russia, pretty much there was a similar emerging view of the carefully planned and executed Russian Revolution, with Westerners thinking it was more a matter of manipulation, and then historians, while affirming Bolshevik leadership, nevertheless amplified that with a point of view that emphasized the social or bottom-up aspects, the class aspects, until they came to an understanding of the two polarizations, one between state and society that resulted in October, and the other between social classes. And as I say, these are the foremost of them, of the scholars. The issues they will discuss, which I will mention, and then I will introduce them. How do revolutions end? This is the topic of Sheila Fitzpatrick's presentation. Is this a problem for historians as well as revolutionaries? What made the October Revolution work? In the 1930s, global leadership in the economy seemed to be in the direction of those strong governments, and Jack Goldstone will be concluding our discussion today and talk about what will the 2030s look like in reflection on the October Revolution and its aftermath. May I introduce to my right, Elena Panina from the Russian Duma. She is an academician, a doctor of economic sciences and industrial organization, and we're delighted to have her here. May I mention the 100-year revolution of the 1917 in Russia, international aspects, the Committee for International Affairs, which has just been produced with materials from the parliamentary slushanie. Translation, whatever. Sheila Fitzpatrick. Can I introduce Sheila Fitzpatrick, who's sitting here on my right? Sheila, we've been reading Sheila Fitzpatrick's articles and books now for years in graduate work. She is at the University of Sydney, and before that was at the University of Chicago, and before that at Austin, Texas, the University of Texas. She's the author of many books, including her memoirs called My Father's Daughter, but also on everyday Stalinism, on education and social mobility in the Soviet Union, the Russian Revolution, Oxford University Press, 1998 to 1982, 3 revised in 94, and currently she has more recently published On Stalin's Team, The Years of Living Dangerously, published by Princeton University Press. May I then introduce, sitting next to her, Ron Soni, who is a professor of history and politics at the University of Michigan and also emeritus from the University of Chicago. He also has published a great deal, and his articles aren't mentioned here, but I recommend them, including the book The Russian Revolution and Bolshevik Victory, Visions and Revisions, a Heath book, 1991, Making Workers Soviet, Power, Culture, and Identity, Cornell University Press, 1994, The Soviet Experiment, books separately on Armenia, Georgia, and nationalism, and more recently, 1999, Intellectuals in the Articulation of the Nation, so on nationalism. May I introduce next to him Dan Orlovsky, who is from SMU in the United States, and he is a professor of Russian history who has devoted much of his life to the studies of the Russian Revolution, and this will be forthcoming in a book, Russia's Democratic Revolution, University of California, and has written a book on the 19th century and closer to the revolutionary times, the hidden class, white-collar workers in the Soviet 1920s. May I now introduce Robert Service, who is a colleague of mine from the University of Oxford and has written a stunningly large number of books, including biographies of Stalin, Lenin, and Trotsky, and a history of modern Russia from Nicholas to Putin, and is now finishing up Russia and its Islamic world and the last of the Tsars, Tsar Nicholas II, and the Russian Revolution. Next to him, may I introduce, please, Stephen Kotkin, who is at Princeton University, and he has also written major works, The Historical Legacies of Communism in Russia and Eastern Europe, Stalin, most recently, 2014 and 17, Volume 1 and Volume 2, Waiting for Hitler, and The Cultural Gradient, 2003, The Transmission of Ideas in Europe. And of course, we all remember those who were studied when I did using and teaching in long ago, 1990 Steel Town, a major historical work from the Gorbachev era. May I introduce then, before we get to you, Jack, Mark Steinberg, the lived historical experience from the University of Illinois, and he is also currently the president of the Association of Slavic, Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And he has written from St. Petersburg, Fin de siècle, New Haven, Yale, 2011. He has moved on to a full history of the Russian Revolution, 1905 to 1921, Oxford University Press in 2017. And Jack Olson. Jack is actually almost a fellow colleague at RANYEPA. He has written many books on revolution, including and one called Why Europe, The Rise of the West in World History, but also Understanding Revolutions of 2011, Political Democracy, Revolutions, a very short introduction, 2014. I think that just about does it. Let me give the floor to Professor Petrov.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you so much, Carol. And I would like to say a couple of words recalling the events of 1 year ago. In the very same room at our previous Gaidar Forum, we hosted a session on the beginning of the revolution. And now, after 1 year, we gathered together here just to summarize, to wrap up the outcomes of the revolution. So, in my opinion, in the past year, so the moment we are experiencing is the moment of creating a uniform space of historiography. So, Soviet historians would often criticize Western historians, and they would not perceive them as peers. However, today the situation has changed, and our today's meeting is an illustration that we have some wonderful researchers in Slavic and Russian studies from many countries, and we are in a dialogue. Well, of course, we don't agree everywhere, but we have like a uniform, de-idealized historical space. So we had a lot of events in recent year, and I would like to say that the reaction from the state to the 100th anniversary of the revolution was like passive, but the society really felt moved, and our community of the researchers hosted dozens of conferences, a host of books and articles were published. So, and as part of our scientific community, I can say that we are really satisfied the way 100th anniversary was celebrated in Russia. So we had a chance to publish a wide range of our opinions. So, and I brought here a book in 2 volumes we prepared in the Russian History Institute of RIS, so the power and the revolution. So I brought it just to give it to Mr. Vladimir Mao as a present, and I hope we will see him. And I would like to repeat that many books like this one were published. So, and in terms of the meaning, so as an historian of economy, it was important to me that we moved away from the economic dictate in explaining the reasons of the revolutions. And it's clear to us that not only economics can be used to explain the reasons behind the revolution in Russia and in other countries. There were some other important factors, and we moved away from the old statement of Lenin that the revolution is the result of popularization of masses, and this is something quite important. Also, we could arrive to a uniform position which is shared by the majority of Russian historians regarding the phenomenon it was the Russian Revolution. So we came to the conclusion that this was an event, a process which could be reviewed as a uniform process from February 1917 till the creation of the Soviet Union. So we came to the conclusion that these events should be called the Great Russian Revolution. And I'm saying great not just to overestimate it. We, of course, all feel it was a national tragedy, but this is about the scale of the events, because the revolution in Russia transformed not only Russia alone, but the entire world of 100 years ago. So this new approach to the events of 100 years ago as the Great Revolution could enabled us to avoid this dichotomy between the February Revolution and the October Revolution, like the case of Giraldins and Jacobins during the Great French Revolution. So we likewise had liberals and Bolsheviks, and the civil war that followed was a manifestation of an open confrontation where all main revolutionary processes revealed. As for the negative events or the processes that influenced the social conscious, so the conspirological approach to the revolution was continuously approached. So the manipulations Carol mentioned earlier today, so we saw it in the press and we saw the movies demonstrating that approach. And I recalled a line from Vysotsky that it was all staged up by Churchill in 1918. But now we knew that actually Parvus was behind it in 1915. So I don't think it was the best way to celebrate the revolution, just showing such movies in the year of the anniversary. And there were, I couldn't find even a single historian in the captions as the authors of the films. So that means that the society doesn't benefit from the contribution of historians. And tomorrow we'll have the closing meeting of the organization committee created 1 year ago for celebrating the 100th anniversary of the revolution. So we will draw our conclusions, and we will conclude this chain of events dedicated to the celebration of revolution. So, and I would be happy to listen to my foreign colleagues. So, as for me, I'm not a foreign colleague. I'm from Russia, but Yuri Alexandrovich, thank you so very much. I would like to say that it's not like this, that the government didn't take any part in celebration. As you correctly said, Yuri Alexandrovich, it is a tragic date. Those were tragic days in our history, but to celebrate the date as the greatest in Russian and also world history, I cannot agree with you, because we had a ruling passed by the President of the Russian Federation on events and arrangements on commemoration and celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And following this ruling, the organizational committee presided by the Chancellor of the Moscow Institute of Foreign Relations, Mr. Torkunov, was created. And the committee, together with the leaders of the State Duma, organized public hearings. So it was done under the umbrella of the Committee on Interparliamentary Affairs, and we tried to link it with the internal processes, and we invited to the hearings not only representatives from Russia, not only the researchers community, and we had a lot of scientists, but also representatives of the Russian diaspora living abroad, the descendants of our first wave of immigrations, the clergy, the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Islamic leaders. So there was a wide representations, and hence we got a wider range of opinions. And I would like you to know that really, even today, during our public hearings, we arrived at the conclusion and accepted the position expressed by the historical science that this is a revolution which should not be regarded as only an internal Russian event, but rather as a great event that transformed the global space at that period of time. And I'm not inclined to believe in conspirological theories that the revolution was brought from outside, as some of our media tried to present, but we couldn't, of course, ignore some external aspects. Of course, mainly the reasons of the revolution were internal, not only economic, but there was a big split between the elites and serious corruption, loss of control and governance from the Tsarist government, which at that time, to a large extent, lost control over processes in the country, especially during the World War I. But of course, Russia at that time wasn't a banana republic where you could have manipulated the situation and bring the revolution from outside. And likewise, the Soviet Union back in 1991 wasn't a banana republic. And of course, there were some external factors, and we must remember about it, talking about the history of today. Even in 1905, the first Russian Revolution was the event which many publications which opposed the official Tsarist governments. So most of them were published abroad, and they were brought into Russia.
And all revolutionaries resided abroad, not in Russia, elsewhere. Some of them were connected to the intelligence service. It should also be noted that this is something that fueled the revolutionary process, although the core reasons were domestic. During the Civil War, this external intervention and external influence were felt sharper than before. Now, the State Department has declassified several documents which indicate that back in 1917, they drew up a map where the Russian Empire was divided between various countries, members of the Entente and North America. And it was contemplated that there would be no Russia at all afterwards. So I believe this is something we should take due note of. As a result of the Civil War and Revolution, these tragical developments that persisted for years, back in 1922, Russia was shoved back 100 years back in its development, more than 100 years back. This is something that was noted at our parliamentary hearings. The rebuilding and revival of the Soviet Union within the borders of the former Russian Empire, except for Poland and Finland, the borders remained roughly the same. That experience demonstrated that an idea could engulf the entire nation, could become the cause for restoration and rebuilding in a very short lifespan. A lot of negative sentiments have been voiced in recent years about the Soviet Union and the Soviet era. However, being scholars and researchers, we must draw the line between the negative effects, like the reprisals, etc., and the progress of a nation. We believe that the 20th century has brought about a social state, a concept which never had existed before that, with an 8-hour working day, etc., something which is considered to be normal in a regular Western country nowadays. So then the colonial system fell apart, and then there came a victory in World War II. Our country was part of a broad coalition, let's admit that. And still we made a contribution to our common victory. So when we are talking about the Great Russian Revolution, and I believe that we really need to bring together the February and the October and other revolutions together as a single revolutionary process, we should further realize that we need to come to consent as society. When we got prepared for our parliamentary hearings, we felt sharp confrontation in opinions and approaches. So I believe it was right that we did that under the auspices of the International Relations Committee of the State Duma. And we resolved that we should probably set up a memorial to mark those years and revolution as it is. Not a kind of a statue where the Red Army soldier hugs a White Army soldier. Not so black and white, not so primitive, something more delicate, something more And now I'd like to pass the floor on to my international colleagues.
We're delighted that that happened, yeah.
Thank you. So, is it working? You can hear me? Closer. Okay. I'll try like this. So, although I'm the first of the foreign speakers, I'm actually going to speak about the end of the revolution, not the beginning. And my question is, how do you end a revolution? This is a problem for revolutionaries on the one hand, and it's also a problem for historians. So let's take as our working definition of revolution a great political and social upheaval whose participants imagine themselves to be creating a new world, consciously freeing themselves of the shackles of the past. Gripped by the moment of madness that tells them that all is possible, revolutionaries may believe that the moment is eternal. Yet common sense tells us that it is not, and that sooner or later normality will return, albeit in a world that actually is transformed in many ways, not all of them intended. Closer. For revolutionaries, for revolutionaries, the problem is that you can't say that you are ending the revolution for fear of losing credibility with supporters. But at the same time, you must end revolutionary turmoil in order to get on with the business of governing. If you don't learn how to govern, you will be unable to implement your plans for radical change. Now, the Bolsheviks, having taken power in October, made several attempts at that transition from revolution to regular government. The first one, in my interpretation, is NEP, the new economic policy, as Lenin put it, seriously for a long time, a transition intended from the ultra-revolutionism of war communism during the Civil War. Then in the mid-30s, you have, after, of course, the great upheavals of the beginning of the 1930s, you have a turn to more conciliatory, traditional social and cultural policies. This is only in a limited sphere, of course, which has been labeled in, actually in American historiography, though it was a Russian who produced the label, the Great Retreat by Timoshev. And it was, Trotsky also noted this phenomenon. He called it the Great Betrayal, having another interpretation of these phenomena. So this, of course, followed Stalin's revolution from above, collectivization, full nationalization of industry and urban trade, first five-year plan, and it did not involve a retreat from those policies. Therefore, its retreat was a limited one. But by the mid-30s, Stalin and the new elite were acquiring the manners, dress, and attitudes of rulers of a nation rather than revolutionaries. But a lot of turmoil and disorder was left around, first as a byproduct of the revolution from above, and second as a consequence of the Great Purges, later in the 1930s. Now, in retrospect, the Second World War can be seen as completing the process of transition out of revolution into a stable post-revolutionary regime, even although, in this case, there were no explicit pronouncements on this subject or policy changes. Why I note the Second World War as being an important event in ending the revolution was that the war itself became understood as a struggle for survival of a nation state, not of a revolution. The terminology had shifted, the conceptual foundations had shifted. Furthermore, the post-war goals, after the war ended, these were not further revolutionary transformation, as in the early 30s, but rather reconstruction of what had been built before the war and destroyed during it. Now, so much for revolutionaries on the question of how do you end the revolution. What about historians? Now, revolutions are not like earthquakes, where the tremor starts at a definable moment in time and ends, often after many post-quake shudders, at another definite time. A revolution is what we call a constructed event. The participants, outside observers, subsequent commentators, decide that various manifestations of discontent and protest amount to something big, and we call that a revolution. By calling it a revolution, we dignify it. It's not just disorders, besporiadki, it's not even just revolts or mutinies, it's something larger with more world historical significance. when the Bolsheviks took power, they called their taking of power revolution the Great October Socialist Revolution. But their opponents often denied it that status, implicitly downgrading it by calling it a mere coup, переворот. Unlike with an earthquake or volcanic eruption, there are no objective scientific data to tell us whether this is or is not a revolution. It's a matter of judgment, that is a matter of opinion. And that opinion can change over time. We heard something on terminology with the new term of the Great Russian Revolution coming into fashion. There also were suggestions that, in fact, it would be better not to call it the revolution anymore, but to call it переворот. That seems to have been dropped, but I remember reading that in 2015 or so. So the whole matter of terminology is very much freighted with the interpretation that we wish to give. So just as deciding when something is a revolution is a matter of opinion, often related to the author's political inclinations, so is the question of when a revolution begins and ends. Now, I'm not going to deal with beginnings, having only a limited time, but I will say something about endings as far as historians are concerned. Now, there have been various alternative endings for the Russian Revolution. The simplest way of ending it would be just to take October. October, the Bolsheviks are in power, and that's it. That is, in effect, the understanding of revolution in a book that was published for the centenary year by China Mieville, the fantasy writer, but it's been widely read. This is his understanding: is the revolution is the thing that ended with October. Now, at the moment, I think a dominant choice about where to end, which Yuri Petrov mentioned, says it's the end of the Civil War. To say with October nothing's finished, you need to actually fight it out, and there you get an ending. Now, Mark Steinberg, in his book, which we'll be talking about later on, also takes this ending. But I think with the same notion that it's not definitively resolved until after the end of the Civil War. Now, that date was also taken by Leonard Shapiro, a very influential political historian, Russian emigre political historian in Britain, in his book, The Origins of the Communist Autocracy. It was, oh my goodness. And the reason he took the date of 1921, 1922, it was at that point that he felt the fateful decisions had been taken to become an autocracy. So I see that I don't have the opportunity to describe other end dates, including my own, in my book, because I actually, in my Russian Revolution, I include the Great Purges. But I won't, at this moment, describe why I do that. But I will just mention one other date given by some historians for the end of the revolution, and that is the collapse of the Soviet Union. In other words, in 1991. That was the date that Martin Melia, in his Soviet tragedy, took. He decided he saw the whole period of Soviet power as an ultimately ossified permanent revolution. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, he wrote, Russia awoke as from a bad dream amidst the rubble of a now septuagenarian disaster. Now, François Furet, around the occasion of the bicentenary of the French Revolution, famously said the revolution is finished, by which he meant it ought to be finished. In other words, we ought to stop talking about it. We ought to stop having it at the center of our political debates. But the vigor of the French debates during the bicentenary suggests that his statement may have been premature. Now, during last year's centenary here in Russia, nobody said outright that the revolution is finished. But the Russian Federation's, the fact that there was not, well, there were official commemorations, but not exactly at a state level. In other words, and as I understand it, in Russia there was well, certainly there was not any particular event other than scholarly conferences and so on to mark that event. Anyway, that downplaying, you might say, of the centenary was perhaps not exactly an assertion that the revolution was over, but perhaps conveyed a wish that the revolution, being a controversial issue, would go away and not have to be officially commented upon. So this was in many respects a welcome change from the well-established Russian-Soviet pattern that an official line is always required so that people know what to think about an event. When one has no official line, of course, it probably facilitates the expression of different kinds of opinions, which I think were very amply expressed in scientific and scholarly conferences. Still, I think that in the long term, the Russian Revolution is too big an event in Russian history and in the global history of the 20th century to be officially ignored in its country of origin. It needs to be turned into what historians, yes, I am finishing, what historians call a usable past. That is a chapter in the bigger story of the nation that helps Russians understand who they are, where they have come from, and where they are going. Now, creating that usable past is a task for future politicians, public intellectuals, and historians. However they choose to do it, my guess is that when the bicentenary comes around in 2117, Russia will officially mark that occasion. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those remarkable comments. Thanks, Sheila.
You have one, don't you? Okay.
First, let me thank the organizers for inviting me to come. I was very happy to come. It's really a wonderful occasion. And to be in Russia to mark the revolution, of course, is something that, as a historian of the revolution, I'm very happy to be part of. About a year and a half ago, I had the privilege of teaching at the Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg and living on Ploshchad Truda, right in the center of the city. And I could notice that in that fall, that the people around me and the scene in Petersburg itself hardly resembled what had happened 100 years before. This was a post-Soviet space. And instead of anything resembling any kind of socialism, neoliberal capitalism had triumphed. I'd talk to a taxi driver or the university professors or my landlord and his friends, and I suddenly would realize that most people share deeply conservative rather than progressive habits of mind. A combination of relative isolation from much of the world, mixed with curiosity about the material comforts and pleasures of the West, created sensibilities that were left over from Soviet times. People seem to have a kind of palpable anxiety about the future and the dangers presented by foreigners and foreign powers, particularly my own country, the United States. At the same time, my friends and colleagues clung to the expectation that government ought to protect and promote its citizens. They still had these old Soviet ideas and habits. Apparently, you can take Russia out of the Soviet Union, but you can't take the Soviet Union out of Russia. 1917, of course, was a great cataclysm within the first great cataclysm of the short 20th century, that being the Great War that set off what many historians, left and right, have called the International Civil War that would last until the end of the 20th century. The revolutionaries in Petrograd in 1917 were initially motivated by hunger and cold and resentment. Just be in Petersburg sometime in the winter, you'll see what I mean, at the callousness and incompetence of the Tsarist government. We forget sometimes that it was women who first came out on the street on International Women's Day, February 23rd, March 8th, and they shamed the men in the factories to come out and join them. This was an inchoate rebellion, which then became a revolution when the soldiers, including the Imperial Guards regiments, refused to fire on the crowds, and the Tsar was just a short man in a funny uniform. He abdicated, and Duma politicians sent up a provisional government, and the workers and soldiers elected their own representatives, suspicious as they were of the bourgeoisie, in the Soviets. I took the topic that we were given today, Uroki Revolution, seriously, lessons of the revolution, and I think that the first lesson that I would draw from 1917 was that ordinary people, with only the most perfunctory leadership, could make history. They could topple a 300-year-old dynasty and initiate radical social change with unpredictable consequences. In the 7 months that followed February, Russia experienced a festival of democratic experimentation. Every constituency in the city and throughout the country formed committees, held meetings, elected delegates to congresses, passed resolutions, and expressed directly their fears of counter-revolution and their hopes for a more just, egalitarian, and participatory political system and social order. But civil war was in the air. From the very first days of the revolution itself, the two governments, Dvoyevlastia, dual power, expressed that parts of the city, parts of the country, did not believe in or trust the other part. The upper classes, middle classes on one side, the working people at the bottom. So I would say that the second lesson of the revolution was that when no shared consensus on a future order unites a polarized society, as in Russia in 1917, the possibility of a broad democratic governing coalition is impossible to form. And who understood that best of all? Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. He and the Bolsheviks understood that there could not be a coalition of the vital forces of the nation, as advocated by their former comrades, the Mensheviks, and called instead for all power to the Soviets, Vся vlast Sovietom. That is, think about it, Soviet government is a government that excludes the middle and upper classes, what was known then as Tsenzovoye Общество, and limited the government to what Russians then called demokratia, the democracy, the people who worked with their hands or served with arms. Class conflict, in other words, in major cities made the victory of the Bolsheviks possible, but Soviet power was at the same time a declaration of civil war against those who oppose that idea of government. Well, progressively, with the Bolsheviks' overthrow of the relatively democratic elected Constituent Assembly in January 1918, the emasculation of worker and Soviet institutions, and 4 years of fighting against white counter-revolutionaries, anarchist and peasant armies, foreign interventionists, separatist nationalists, and even more moderate socialists, those possible democratic institutions and practices of 1917 atrophied, evaporated. Terror replaced persuasion, military discipline, and the prohibition of factions within the Communist Party by 1921 eliminated the rough and tumble infighting of the Bolsheviks before the end of the Civil War. Bureaucracy burgeoned, and the political decision-making narrowed first to the Central Committee, then to the Politburo, and ultimately to one man, Joseph Stalin. I suppose the harshest lesson of the revolution was that war and civil war polarized politics even further, undermined democratic choices, and give well-placed elites enormous discretion to shape the nature of a political regime. Without strong institutions to constrain the actions of those in positions of influence and power, however humane and progressive their ambitions and goals, the will of ordinary people will be compromised, even jettisoned, thrown on the trash heap of history. This lesson would be later made even more starkly with the final crisis of the Soviet Union, when ostensible Democrats attempted to overthrow communist rule only to weaken the entire polity. Self-proclaimed reformers around Boris Yeltsin then carried out their own coup in October of 1993 and imposed a powerful presidency that eventually in the long reign of Vladimir Putin. Journalists, and many in the West, even scholars, have facilely explained the failure of Russians to achieve more democratic and representational politics in 1917-1921, and again in 1989 to 1993, as the fault of ordinary Russians and Soviet people. After all, they say, Russians are a people with a deep authoritarian streak who possess a political culture or maybe even a genetic propensity to love slavery, disregard the values of human life, and yearn for strong men to rule them. Unlike Americans, of course, we don't like strong men to rule us. Such fantasies of national character and embedded culture are much more revealing of their authors than the actual experience and history of the largest country on the globe. And such essentialist, naturalized claims about Russia or its leader Vladimir Putin, which have become a staple in American politics, of course, only lead to confusion rather than to enlightenment. Russian leaders, including Lenin, had choices, but made choices that led further away from democracy and the actual decision-making by the very people they claim to represent. Think about the turning point of March 1921, when NEP was instituted, economic reforms, but the party was tightened, factions were outlawed, Kronstadt was suppressed, as was Tambov and other places. Soviet-style communism, it seems to me, collapsed at a moment of the triumph of neoliberal economics and what I would call bourgeois democracy. At the turn of the 21st century, socialism in most of its forms, as I learned in Petersburg last year, has disappeared. As in 1917, so in a century later, we are living in a time of global crisis, both economic and political. But now the challenge for ordinary people, for those progressive politicians, is to find a way beyond the limits of bourgeois democracy toward a sustainable democratic system, which must include something like socialism. By socialism, we learned from the Soviet experience, this does not mean state control of all society and communication, but it can mean something more social democratic, simply thinking of policies and programs that aim at the public good rather than personal profit and corporate profit. The basic takeaway from October and the Soviet experience, in my view, is that there is no real socialism without democracy, while the fundamental takeaway from current Russian and American politics is there's no full democracy without socialism, without thinking more and more about the public good. Well, it's always easier for a scholar to sit up here and state the nature of a problem than to find a solution. Perhaps the first tentative state that this panel and the earlier speakers have said is to think more clearly about the history of the 20th century, what missteps were made and what successes were achieved. Understanding the past, how the present was constructed, is the only way we can think about possible futures and get out of the dark times that may lay ahead. Maybe progressive discourses, knowledge of history, are powerful enablers and constraints. Maybe a new, more positive, even utopian discourse about democracy and socialism will provide a light at the end of a dark tunnel. Right now, our problem, and the problem particularly for young people, is to find that tunnel. Thank you.
I agree, and those ideas have been so powerful for so many decades. Thank you both, Sheila Fitzpatrick and Ron Suney. Now we have Dan Orlovsky from Southern Methodist University.
Okay. Okay. Pardon? So I'm going to look at this a little differently, sort of digging into the question of revolution in the year 1917. And I just want to do a couple of things, make a couple of points. First of all, I believe that one of the things about this centennial is that it's allowed us to make a sharp refocus on the idea of revolution and the year 1917 itself. This is not to disparage World War I or the deeper roots or the Civil War or NEP or certainly the revolutionary upheavals of the 1930s in the Soviet Union. I just believe that revolution with a capital R is something a little bit different. Those other things we might call revolutionary, but I still believe that we should be focusing on some phenomenon called the revolution that took place in 1917, both February and October. This was, as has already been stated by Sheila Fitzpatrick and Ron Sunni, a time of upheaval, a time of great emotion, a time of violence, a time of hopefulness. One might even say a time of madness. And for me, it is the time that revolution becomes a historical actor. That's what makes it different from what went on in World War I earlier, and to a certain extent what takes place later during what we call the Civil War. Now there is a tendency in the historiography to look at the whole period as a grand civil war, to eliminate the idea of revolution altogether, to look at civil wars generally, globally, historically, going back to antiquity as the dominant form of revolutionary social change, and to see the victors of civil wars only post facto calling their victories revolutionary. I don't agree with this for the reasons I've already stated. We don't want to lose what was unique, special, profound about the 1917 upheaval itself. Okay. Second point is that we need to reassess, and we have been reassessing what I call the endgame of this revolution in September and October of 1917, to give it fully the same credence we give the re-examination of the February days, which has been done in great detail by a number of important scholars. When it comes to September and October and the Bolshevik victory, the Bolshevik triumph, we still to this day pretty much accept the Bolshevik narrative, the Bolshevik story, the triumphal sort of march of Soviet power, the seizure of power by the people in the name of the party led by Lenin. And in my studies, I find something I think that's quite different, already alluded to also by Ron Sunni and to a certain extent by Sheila Fitzpatrick, and that is alternatives and a different way of looking at this endgame in October. Principally the alternative put forth by the Mensheviks, but also by SRs, the Mensheviks, Martov in particular, and Don, to create a unified socialist government in August, September, and October 1917. And what I find in looking at this that's different from what's been done earlier is that in the past we tended to look at this as part of the history of parties. This was a Menshevik story or an SR story versus the Bolsheviks. I see it more, and so did Martov, and there's a lot of evidence to support this, as a social movement, part of a large social revolution of lower middle class intelligenti, technical personnel, experts of various kinds who worked in the Zemstva, in the war industries committees, in the infrastructure, in the cooperatives, and even in the Soviets themselves. And Martov argued quite clearly that his idea was that there should be a democratic revolution, a democracy, not a Soviet outcome. Soviets were transitory, transitional, class-based. They claimed to speak for the workers, but they didn't do that entirely well, and they didn't represent whole other realms of democratic layers of society in Russia. So he wanted to see a broader-based democratic revolution. The Soviets would be transitory, and there were a lot of people who followed this idea. It should be taken seriously if you look at the records of the Democratic Conference, of the Council of the Republic, of the parties that were meeting in those months. You can see this, it all comes out quite clearly. You see it in the newspapers. You see it in articles that proclaim that the Soviets were moving toward irrelevancy in October. And it was Lenin's genius to turn this around somehow and to claim the ability to project his vision as a kind of alternative reality, to use the modern terminology, backed up by great connections to the military forces and a much greater willingness to rely on violence. Violence is a very important topic in the revolution. Shouldn't be forgotten. It's there, running through it as a red thread. So when the end game takes place and Kerensky is abandoned even by the Council of the Republic, they won't give him an endorsement on the eve of the revolution. Power goes to something called the Military Revolutionary Committee. Also an interesting institution, multi-layered, made up of different kinds of social groups. We need to get away from looking at parties and more toward these kinds of social groups, because that becomes the sort of motive force in the Civil War later, which is kind of revolution phase 2, the working out of the hopes, the processes of 1917. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dan. That was Dan Orlovsky. Now we move to Robert Service from University of Oxford.
I take... can you hear me? No. I don't... right.
Maybe right into
the
end of it.
The October Revolution was a revolution led by doctrinaire revolutionaries who had no intention of making it only a great Russian revolution. Their idea was that it was going to be a European socialist revolution or it was going to be nothing. So their idea was that the whole of Europe would be set aflame by the seizure of power in a single city on November the 7th, 1917. The Bolsheviks had an exceptional chance to carry out their revolution because of the political, administrative, economic, and eventually military breakdown of the former imperial power in Petrograd. So Lenin got lucky. It was also enabled by the temporary inactivity and ineptitude of the domestic counter-revolution. This is a contrast with what happened in, say, Hungary or Munich in 1919, or indeed northern Italy in 1920. The Bolsheviks were also lucky that they could come to power on the basis of support from workers and soldiers, and they had the hope that they would also acquire the support of the Russian peasantry. Without this revolutionary ferment from below, the Bolsheviks would have been nowhere in 1917. But the very big point to make, I think, is that the October revolution at the time was regarded as a very unlikely revolution in terms of its prospects of survival. The Bolsheviks talked about sitting on their suitcases, packed suitcases. They expected they might have to flee, that they would share the fate of the Paris Commune of the 1870s. They quickly met with disappointment. The revolution didn't spread across the Eastern Front sufficiently well. The Germans insisted and imposed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The Hungarian and the Munich revolutions were suppressed, and the attempt to export revolution on the point of a bayonet failed in the Polish War of 1920. The Soviets that had so proudly asserted themselves in 1917 often became hostile to Bolshevik power. And it soon became apparent that the workers who had been so pro-Bolshevik in 1917 had their doubts about the Bolsheviks very quickly. And the Bolsheviks had no compunction about suppressing workers' demonstrations by force of arms. And the peasants to whom Lenin, through his land decree, had given the land, proved to be lacking in gratitude for the gift. They wanted to be able to conduct their affairs on the basis of making profit from their hard-won harvest. The Bolsheviks had a series of fundamental obstacles to the passage of Russia into a fully socialist republic. One of them, I should just mention, was that most people still believed in God, whereas Bolsheviks were militant atheists. And all areas of the former Russian Empire had strong local traditions that would have to be somehow got rid of if Bolshevism was to be imposed. And all of this happened after the October Revolution in conditions of urban economic collapse. The Bolsheviks were lucky in as much as they held on to the main towns and were able to use the stocks of industrial and military materials that had been bequeathed to them by Nicholas II and then by Kerensky. But they didn't regenerate the urban sector of the economy in the Civil War, and moreover, they had to face newly restored counter-revolutionary forces in that civil war. So what did they do? They had no real plan. They had no real plan because they had been disappointed in terms of their fundamental vision, which was of European socialist revolution. So they stumbled towards inventing something that truly was of world historical importance, a one-party state, which before 1918 and 1919 seemed to be a contradiction in terms. A party state should have a multiplicity of parties. This was the first serious one-party state, and it has the aspiration to become a one-ideology state, and it certainly had the growing capacity to undertake societal mobilization, to treat the population as a human resource for agitation and direction and mobilization. So this was a very, very aggressive militant state. And in 1922, the system was completed with the introduction of a formal pre-publication censorship. Glavlit lasted until the autumn of 1991. So most of the characteristics of the Soviet state as we know it were put in place over a 5-year period. And the final serious coping stone of this system was the ban on factions in 1921. The party then had to be turned into the vanguard of the revolution, because none of the other public agencies, the Soviets, the trade unions, could be trusted. The Bolsheviks only trusted themselves, and they had only one place to express that trust, and that was the party. And it was out of this experimentation in 1917 through to 1918 and 1919 that this extraordinary world historical invention took place. Now, it's been mentioned that the NEP was introduced in 1921. The NEP restored the economy, but it gave little prospect of allowing Soviet Russia to become competitive with foreign advanced capitalist powers. And Stalin took the decision that he was going to deal with the problem of the profusion of priests, the profusion and proliferation of kulaks, the apathy shown by most workers to the demands of Marxism, Leninism. He would deal with this by introducing a much more brutal form of Leninism than had been attempted heretofore. And he would make this brutal form of communism propulsive. He wouldn't simply seize industrial stocks, as Lenin had done in 1918 and 1919. He would expand the economy, aggressively expand the economy, and he would do it at the price of a vicious agricultural collectivization, so as to be able to export funds and buy German technology in the first place. When Hitler came to power, this was no longer possible. So he bought technology from the Americans. Now, here is one of the cardinal reasons why Soviet communism failed. When the Cold War started in the late 1940s, then embargoes were placed upon technological transfer of military significance. At that point, over decades, the Soviet Union ceases to be in any way a competitive power, even though it was the second biggest industrial power in the world. It could defeat Hitler, it could make the A-bomb and then the H-bomb in certain restricted spheres under very tight state control. It could be competitive, but not comprehensively as a global power. It had to rely on the unearned income of oil and gas in order to sustain itself in the second half of the 1970s. Now, what does all this mean? It means that just as the Soviet Union failed as a communist state in the 1980s, and most communist states ceased to exist, we now only have Cuba, North Korea, and China, plus one or two others. But we have a state in China that is dynamic, that has defied the picture that I've drawn of the cul-de-sac of communism. We don't know what China is going to do with its own peculiar amalgam of the wildest capitalism and the wildest oppressive communism.
Thank you very much. That was Robert Service from the University of Oxford. We move now to Stephen Kotkin from Princeton University.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I thank the organizers for the honor of the invitation to be included on the panel. And I thank the audience for still being here. Not because the panel's uninteresting, but because this is the biggest panel I've ever been on. The biggest panel besides this was when I was last in the audience. So it's quite something you guys have done here. When I got this assignment, I imagined that there were three things I could do besides giving up. And the three things were give some detail about the revolutionary process and how spectacular it was, I have discovered that the revolution itself remains more interesting than the books that we write about the revolution. That's why Mikhail Zygar did such a magnificent job with that website, bringing the immediacy of 1917 back. So I'm not going to do that because Zygar did that better than I am going to be able to. The second possibility I imagined for myself was to put the Russian example into a global context, meaning there are many specificities of the Russian Revolution, but maybe there's a larger revolutionary process story and even interwar period story. I decided I didn't have time to do that one. So that left me with the third proposition, which was to talk about the long sweep of Russian history in 8 minutes. And I decided I had time for that. So on the 7 minutes left, or 6.5, that's what I'm going to try to do. We have a problem. The problem is that Russia is so open. So much can happen here. So much change, upheaval, revolt, revolution can happen here, and yet we seem to be stuck in a kind of cyclical pattern. We have these gigantic participatory revolutions and revolts, and then we have some version of autocratic government, again and again and again. And I agree with my colleague that attributing this to Russian national character is a failure of analysis, because the revolts wouldn't fit the autocratic national character story ipso facto. So I'm going to give, crazy as this sounds, but then again, look up here. Crazy as this sounds, I'm going to give a theory of Russian history related to geopolitics in just a few strokes. I'm going to give 4 bullet points, or what you call 4 tezisa. So the first one is that Russia imagines itself as a providential power, as a power under God, a special country with a special mission in the world. It's not the only country with this sense of itself as a providential power. We see that with my country, the United States. We see it with the Chinese. One time we saw it with the British and the French. It's mostly gone. We had there. We saw it with the Germans and the Japanese. With the Germans and Japanese, it was bombed out of them in the Second World War for the most part. Yes. So this is not unique to Russia, but it's deeply present in Russia. The second bullet point is that Russian state capacities and Russian societal capacities, which could be even more important, never match the aspirations of being a country with a special mission in the world. Russia is never the greatest power. It is instead in the first rank or in the second rank, but behind other powers usually called the West. There is a discrepancy or a gap between Russia's aspirations and Russia's capacities. This leads me to my third point, my third bullet point, or thesis. And that is the discrepancy between the aspirations and the capacities leads to a recourse to the state as an instrument, using the state to manage the gap with the West or to overcome the gap with the West. Meaning, some level of coercion, it varies through time, it can be very violent or not very violent, but some version of coercive modernization to force the country in a direction to close the gap with the West and to try to attain the aspirations of being a special country in the world with a special mission. Thesis number 4. Thesis number 4 is that the quest for the strong state, the desire to build a strong state, to use the state as an instrument for coercive modernization to close the gap with the West, this quest leads again and again to personal rule. It is an unbelievable paradox of Russian history that you get personal rule again and again and again. You then get the conflation of the personal rule survival, the interests of the personal ruler, with the interests of the state. And it becomes treasonous to criticize the personal rule. It's as if you're criticizing Russian state interests. This conflation between personal rule and the state is extremely detrimental. Now, if I'm correct, you're supposed to laugh at that point. If I'm correct in this analysis, what this means... Это потом, Юрий Александрович. Это между собой выясним отношения. Ладно?
Oh, that's outside. So we can sort this out later, in private. I'm the youngest here. I should have spoken the last.
Has to speak, let alone to contradict anyone. So if this is correct, you get a picture of a state-led coercion, which gives you a spurt, a leap, skachok. And then it's followed by a period of stagnation. And so the coercive modernization seems to be useful, it seems to be successful, it seems to be necessary, but it is to peak, cul-de-sac, again and again and again. Now, yeah, I'm going to easily be the one who meets the time limit here, because I'm done, except for the conclusion. So, we cannot say that it's the same in all time periods. There's a Tsarist Russian version of this. There is a Soviet version of this. If I may, there is a post-Soviet version of this. And they are different. Russia changes. Even within each version, the Tsarist version, the Soviet version, there's evolution. I am not saying that Russia stays the same. I'm saying that there's a geopolitical conundrum, not a national culture per se, that makes Russia seem so open, so ready for change, so susceptible to upheaval, but again and again brings us into a sense of closure, of cyclicality, of long-term patterns, and frustrates us to no end. So the revolution of 1917 was spectacular, but the process of closing the gap with the West only widened further. And the coercive modernization, driven by the desire to be a providential power under God, a special country with a special mission, was felt very strongly. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Stephen Kotkin. I want to underscore and hope that you understand how very different these interpretations are, the way of looking at the revolution, the focus point, and that's why we've got such very different interpretations here. Okay, and thank you. That was really quite extraordinary. Yes, Mark Steinberg from the University of Illinois.
So being penultimate, almost last, one is tempted to comment on what everybody else said, but obviously won't. But in a certain sense, everything I say is a strange commentary. You'll have to judge what that is. I also want to begin in a very strange place, which is to say in prison, where I taught a course on the Russian Revolution to a group of male felons. And while teaching in prison, I thought of many things, needless to say, not least of which is actually the question we often ask, especially around historical anniversaries like that of 1917. And I taught that course in 1917. Why does history, should history matter to us? And that relates to the questions of what conclusions and lessons we draw about this particular history of 1917. Now, one of the lessons that one answer that my students in prison discovered and embraced was this one, which is we lose a great deal, and you'll see the notion of loss there. We lose a great deal about the past itself, but also about the meaning of history in our times when we focus only on what historians have traditionally said is the essence of history, namely the contexts, the causes, and most particularly the outcomes. But we gain a great deal in understanding and for ourselves when we think of the past as human experience, as lived human experience, and all of its vitality, its chaos, its unpredictability, its contradiction. And I admit this recognition has a political edge to it. There is no doubt that history is full of failure, of brutality, of violence, of disenchantment, of tragedy. These are not its inevitabilities, even though they are often its actual outcomes all too often. History's unpredictability and even chaos also means history is always open to possibility and therefore hope. Now, you can imagine for men in prison, often for 15, 20, 35 years, the idea that life, that history, that time, another way to think about history, remains open is obviously compelling. I think it is no less necessary for us. It is no less true, and most important, it's a way to think about how to interpret the Russian Revolution. Let me very briefly be philosophical about this. I'm thinking in particular of the ideas of a group of Marxists, disenchanted, critical Marxist thinkers in the century since 1917, starting first with Ernst Bloch's 1918 book called Spirit of Utopia, and continuing to the present. In other words, thinkers who have thought about history, indeed about time, as a site of possibility, even freedom, with multiple alternatives. In Ernst Bloch's words, all of human history across many, many cultures demonstrates what he called the utopian impulse to venture beyond the limits and inadequacies of the world as it is, beyond what he called the darkness of the lived moment, in order to see and recognize an emerging but no less real not yet, noch nicht in German. Next slide. Half a century later, Hannah Arendt similarly insisted in an essay she wrote on freedom, an important concept for us to think about, that because the, as she put it, infinitely impossible constitutes the very notion, the very essence of everything we call real. After all, human existence is completely unlikely. Our survival to this point, we'll wonder about the future, is also infinitely improbable given the nature of human beings. But therefore, we should, she said, look for the unforeseeable and the unpredictable, be prepared for and expect miracles in the political realm, even though, a key phrase, the scales are weighted in favor of disaster. Next slide. Perhaps, though, the most interesting version of this view of history was offered by Walter Benjamin in 1940 in his essay on the concept of history, where he adapts the old concept, the Marxist metaphor from the 19th century, of revolution as a leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. Benjamin interprets revolution somewhat differently as humanity's leap in the open air of history. A leap, he says, and you can see his words in English and translation and in Russian, blasts open the continuum of history, which is to say the continuum where change is predicated only on what already is, what we can expect, and grasps, he says, the splinters and flashes of redemptive messianic time open towards the future. Bloch called this the emergent but not yet present, not yet, noch nicht. Arendt called this the miracles we should expect, even, maybe especially, in times of crisis. And all three understood painfully well that precisely because catastrophe and disaster is most to be expected in history, we must leap out of the darkness toward freedom. This, you can see where I want to lead with this, is one way to understand the Russian Revolution, namely a time when the continuum of history as we expect it can't change, is blasted open, and the blast is important. This was a violent process, and the not yet felt possible. We can see this at many moments in the history. If I had more time, I'd tell more of them. Most obviously during the days of freedom, after the Tsar was overthrown, people poured out into the streets, embraced, kissed strangers. Viktor Shklovsky recalled this as a time just like Easter, joyous, naive, disorderly, carnival paradise. Letters and petitions to authorities during 1917 called it a sacred time of resurrection, a time of salvation. If I had more time, I'd read this whole quote to you, typical of newspaper articles at the time, you can glance through it, that suggest that these first days, these first weeks and months, was a time literally of the unexpected and therefore of miraculous possibility. This is 1917. He could almost be quoting Bloch and Arendt and Benjamin. It's very tempting, though, to say, well, that's February. February was great. It was a time when freedom was the watchword. Everything seemed possible, but that's not the spirit of October, that sense of enormous possibility and hope. Yet in October, one has to say the darkness of the lived moment, to use that Bloch phrase, was a whole lot greater. The scales of disaster facing people in Russia on the eve of the October Revolution tilted much further toward catastrophe. The economy was collapsing. The war was unending. The state was quite ineffective. People talk not about hope for the future on the eve of October, but about looming collapse and chaos and their own powerlessness to do anything about it. Next slide. And so I would argue, even more than in February, people embraced in October the spirit of the impossible, the idea that giving power to the common people and their representatives might somehow save Russia and indeed the world. The odds, as it's been said, against success were gigantic. People recognized it, and yet they leapt anyway. They believed in what Arendt called the infinitely improbable. I'll go quicker. And they did so because they believed this is how the world should be, and therefore how it could be. Perhaps the core concept driving revolution. I'll finish with one more moment that I want to talk about. The next slide. This one. This was on the first anniversary of the October Revolution, the first moment when people are thinking, what does the October Revolution mean? And the Moscow Soviet held a competition for a bas-relief memorial plaque that would hang, and did, on the Senate Tower above the graves of the fallen, that was unveiled. This was the winner of that competition, unveiled on November 7th, 1918 by Sergei Konyonkov. And you can see the image. At the center is a huge figure with white wings, wearing a crown of eagle feathers. The sun is rising behind her. She holds a palm branch in one hand, a symbol of all sorts of things, martyrdom, salvation. A red banner in the other, another symbol, revolution, socialism, the blood of the fallen. And behind her, you can see the rising sun says October 1917 revolution, and at her feet are all the fallen swords and weapons. Even more interesting is at the ceremony dedicating its work, in which Lenin was there, everybody was there, there was a performance of a cantata, and you see some of the lyrics from the cantata, written by 3 working-class poets, sung by a working-class proletkult choir. So with Konyonkov's, I'll call her the angel of revolution, behind them they sing of, as you can see here, crucifixion, transformation, the final apocalyptic storm, the new day shining, a world transfigured. You get the idea. Now, it might surprise us, and I'll conclude momentarily, it might surprise us that one of the canonical official interpretations of the meaning of the lessons of October was this one. And it wasn't there briefly. It stayed all the way until the 1930s when it finally came down. Every Muscovite, including those who went to see Lenin, always saw this image. nothing was surprising about it at the time. This sort of imagery of wings, of salvation, of crucifixion were very common at the time. And one can interpret this in various ways. For some, clearly, there was a religious meaning to the revolution. Okay. Less than a minute. But more important, and I'll conclude, is the belief that in the catastrophic continuum of history, it is possible to not only leap, even fly into a realm of the new. We know the outcome, but my core argument is let not the outcome of what happened after 1917, at whatever point you think the revolution was lost, ended, or betrayed, but remember the effort, the sense of real possibility, and let us not be so contemptuous of those people of 100 years ago to think they were entirely wrong. Thank you.
Thank you for a very powerful presentation, yet another from this remarkable crowd of people. Jack, before we let you go, no, Professor Buldakov is there. He has one more. Professor Buldakov. Jack Goldstone has something about revolutions in general and about the future, and I wanted to end with that. But Professor Buldakov, didn't you want to say a few words? You don't want to. You also have a remarkable interpretation, do you not?
Слышно?
So can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me well? So honestly, it wasn't my intention to speak. I just wanted to come and listen. So the year was very eventful, and I wanted to have some rest, honestly. So in recent years, I spoke before about 20 conferences, and so I'm a little bit fed up with that. But however, some words about the outcomes of the recent year. So, and my point of view may sound biased, but I would risk to express it anyway. So, first of all, the main thing is that, our government used a very original approach. So they said, you can celebrate, but they didn't tell us how to celebrate. They gave us a hint that we need to make it a nice celebration without the whites or the reds, without any conflicts or wars, and the reaction was surprising. So, and that's the main outcome of the recent year. So everybody started to discuss the revolution, and we organized a host of conferences, and we remembered what we were writing about 30 years ago. So I got an impression that people were silent for 30 years, and then we came to a point that we decided to share everything we had. So for me, the outcome is quite positive, although I could notice any special discoveries. But I believe that we managed to create a forum for subsequent movement, or even a leap forward in our research. And it's no secret that, as for me, I was always looking at the events of 1917 as like the red upheaval, the cycle of crash and revival of the empire. So 20 years ago, in 1997, I published the book, The Dark Times Under the Reds, and my ideas, they fully correspond to what I was telling you 20 years ago. But elsewhere, so we have very few new things, and I'm especially upset by the fact that we don't use sources which are intensively published. We have a lot of memories published. So quite often The memories are reprinted versions of what was published by the emigres, and often there are like some materials from the archives which are largely ignored, sadly. Also, what is in our way? So as Steve Kotkin mentioned, and I loved it, and I would like to continue his third, so the history of revolutions is the history of Russia, a Russian person, and an opportunity to understand what's going on within us, what's special about us that keeps blowing up our statehood, and what forces help to revive and restore the statehood in sometime afterward. So the 1917 and the Civil War were very much like the time of troubles of the 17th century, a very archaic process. So it's not linear, but a cyclic process, and I believe that during the year we could approach the problem. So it wasn't just a breakthrough to the future, a leap into the future, but on the other hand, it turned out that the conservative forces were much stronger, and that they are rooted in the souls of people who made the revolution and who were passionate about breaking through into the future. So the history of the revolution is the history of us all. So what's a person, a human being, not just a Russian? Is he like a mutineer or a conservator or a conformist? It's not, we cannot come to a single conclusion philosophically. So the history of our revolution gives us a brilliant opportunity to tackle these issues, which have the common humanitarian meaning. And I believe that during 1917, so maybe it's too early to summarize, but it was a substantial, a serious step forward. And I believe that in future we succeed to make some further, more important steps in this direction. Thank you.
Professor Buldakov, who has published very much and many articles and many books on the Russian Revolution. Jack Goldstone from George Mason University. He's in public policy, and you remember him probably. He was head of a huge demography research project here not so long ago.
Thank you, Carol. Well, thank you, everyone, for staying through this long, busy panel, but I think these are great people. I'm honored just to be on the stage with them. They're some of the greatest experts on the Russian Revolution and Russian history that scholarship has produced. I've learned an enormous amount from them. I am not an expert on Russian history or the Russian Revolution myself, hence my apologies, and you'll see me repeating much of the wisdom that they've already given us in my talk. I'm a specialist in world history, and particularly global patterns of revolutions, their origins, their outcomes, their effects in world history. And I just want to present things from that point of view. Looked at from inside Russia, the story of 1917 often looks something like this. The Tsarist regime fell as a result of World War I and of internal inequality, poverty, and struggles. The Bolsheviks took advantage of opportunities to seize power. After a tough war, they made Russia strong. They created a Soviet Union that was able to reverse the defeat of World War I and defeat Germany in World War II. After the war, however, the communist regime eventually became stagnant and corrupt, and in 1991, popular uprisings overthrew that regime as well. A nice story of rise and fall of communism, during which communism also inspired revolutions throughout the world and thus had a global impact. Now, as I say, that's a version of the story you see from within side, but viewed from the perspective of world history, I can tell the story differently. And the two elements of that story that I want to stress, just to try and stay within time, I can't be as entertaining as some of my colleagues, but I'll try and be provocative or a bit scary. The two things I want to focus on are that nationalism wins in revolutions, and the second is that democracy is often surprisingly weak. So the first, nationalism tends to be the winning outcome. Revolutions may start promising to rectify injustice, to create inequality, to bring democracy. Sometimes they achieve some of those objectives to a greater or lesser degree. But in the end, what people are really willing to fight for and die for when a regime is threatened is the special character and the special bond they feel with their nation. Whether they're native-born or adopted immigrants, if they feel a bond for that nation, that they're part of a special community, a community with a providential mission from God, or just a community that has a precious, unique character, that's what they will fight for. And in the case of the Russian Revolution, I agree with Professor Fitzpatrick. You can't say it ended in 1917 or 1922. You really have to go past the Stalinist purges and all the way to World War II, because in World War II, the communist regime really gained the support of the Russian people by defending them and creating a victory in World War II and transforming the Soviet Union with Russia at its head into a superpower, to the point where Russians felt whether or not they were personally doing well, there was a surge of pride in living in a superpower. Now, this is part of the story, of course, that Stephen has told, but it's not unique to Russia. Nationalism was the dominant outcome for Nazism as well. It was the dominant outcome eventually of the Meiji Restoration in Japan. Even in France, the dominant figure of the Russian Revolution came to be Napoleon and what his military victory stood for in the Gloire de France, rather than the principles of the rights of men. Now, France did become a democracy. It did try to spread the rights of man and equality, but even in doing so, it ran into this problem of nationalism. Haiti revolted against French control. Later, Algeria and then Vietnam rejected the gifts of membership in the French community, seizing instead the opportunity to defend their own nationhood. And nations seek to defend themselves, especially against threats of occupation and foreign conquest, or being infiltrated by outsiders who bring an alien culture that might somehow undermine or weaken the special character of the national culture. And so you see anxiety about migration if it becomes too large, whether that's in Japan or the United States, in Germany. And you see nationalism assert itself as the result of revolution and war. In the end, it all comes down to my nation is special, my nation first, and human beings simply are tribal. We seem unable to be happy without a sense of belonging to a community that gives our lives situation and importance. I mention that because the Bolsheviks and the Marxist ideology that motivated 1917 was based on the idea of overcoming nationalism. The proletarian revolution was supposed to provide a universal bond among all workers against capitalists. Workers of the world were supposed to unite. And as someone said earlier, Europe is supposed to go up in flames and the revolution should spread everywhere. It did not. The biggest shock, I think, to the Bolsheviks and to communists everywhere was the incredible persistence of nationalism. Now, viewed in this light, let's look at the period from 1917 to the 1930s. What happened in 1917 was not just the fall of the Tsar's autocratic rule in Russia. All the great traditional empires of Eastern Europe, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German monarchy of Kaiser Wilhelm, they all fell. And the aspiration was to replace these traditional monarchies and imperial regimes with something new, something democratic, Western, modern. And it certainly seemed, with Wilson's point, that World War I was the war to make the world safe for democracy. And yet, not even a generation later, democracy was virtually extinct in Europe. Fascism in the form of Italian fascism, German Nazism, the victory of German armies, the Vichy regime, even before that, Franco in Spain, had created a phalanx of authoritarian regimes. Why had this occurred after the great struggle in World War I seemed victorious? Because people were threatened. They were threatened by the specter of Bolshevism and international communism on the one hand, and they were threatened by economic reversals because after World War I, the victorious Allies were not kind to the defeated enemy. They insisted on high reparations. They insisted on accommodation of the fallen to the desires of the victors, creating a sense of resentment and anger against the West. When the economic reverses of the late 20s arose, there was a perfect formula for the spread of an assertive nationalism and the search for strong leaders. And so within a few decades after the great war for democracy in World War I, the fear of this alien socialist threat and economic reversals had created conditions under which the search for strong authoritarian leadership seemed the natural choice to too many people. It was totally unexpected, of course. People did not think that the new democracies would be that weak, but they fell with surprising suddenness and ease in the 30s. Now, situation today, to bring us up to the present, in the 1990-91 period, I'll finish quickly. In the 1991 period, we had another set of conflict, the Great Cold War, the Great Civil War between East and West. Again, it appeared to end in a great victory for the democratic West with the collapse of communist regimes. Yet here we are, again, a few decades removed from that great victory, and we see a surge of autocratic regimes in Turkey, Thailand, China, Hungary, Poland, and arguably huge surges of nationalism and a rejection of many principles of openness and internationalism in Great Britain and the United States. What is happening? Again, people after 91 did not make a comfortable, generous accommodation after the victory of the Cold War. The West simply triumphantly assumed that it was fine to expand NATO up to the borders of Russia, and that Russia itself would fall into line and become a Western-style democracy. There was no respect given, in a sense, to Russia's needs and Russian history. And of course, there was a sense of anxiety that spread. There was an anxiety in this case not about socialism, but about Islamism, because the threat of mindless, dangerous violence and terror coming from the Middle East this time threatened people across Europe, the United States, and Russia. So we had a reenactment, as it were. Again, people across the world were facing, after 2007-9, economic stress, anxiety about this dangerous ideology, this threat of Islam, and they lost trust in their own leaders, who seemed to have no answers for these threats. And with the loss of trust, democracy fails to function well, and people again look for strong leaders. Where will this lead? Well, I worry that as in the 30s, we may have to go through a period in which the thirst for strong leadership weakens the hold of democracies across the West and allows countries like China, Turkey, Russia to feel more secure and to feel that their form of government is the one that will give them strength. And yet, the danger of authoritarian government, whether it's party-based or military, is that it soon leads to personal rule as the ultimate outcome of concentrating power. And personal rule is dangerous because eventually an individual who confuses their own ambitions with the needs of an entire nation makes mistakes. They get overambitious, they get short-sighted, and they start to make decisions that undermine their nation and therefore incur another wave of revolutionary conflict. So I expect that the regimes in Russia, China, Turkey, and elsewhere will also eventually fade. But first, we will have to go through a difficult time.
Thanks so very much. Again, that was Jack Goldstone. And just a couple of things that I want to do before giving the floor finally to Professor Petrov. I wanted to thank Andrei Biely, who's come and sitting in the first row, who organized the first three. This is the last of 4 seminars on the Russian Revolution at this institution at Ranyapa, and thank you very much. He's also historian of the revolution. Still leaving. Yes? And then I want to give the floor to Ron and Sheila in response, because you spoke early.
Well, it's a pleasure to see that after all these years and after such an efforts of prominent authors and prominent historians, we still have questions to be answered, and we still have some things to discuss. And I would like to ask anybody from our group to comment on the differences of the title of our panel, because Russian text is different from English, and maybe that could give us some lesson, and maybe some interesting interpretation of how do we understand the revolution and what was our revolution.
Would you guys like to just say a few words? You spoke early on, and then later there were comments. They had a chance to comment against you, but
I because we have a session in 10 minutes, which is also on the revolution, right? And we probably would need to get to that too.
I think Lenin said once, seize every podium, so I'm taking this chance as well. Yes. So this is something I left out of the paper, but I think it's worth saying. I tell a story in this paper that a Russian historian at a very prominent West Coast university once told me with great conviction that no good had come out of the Soviet Union. There was nothing redeemable or praiseworthy. And I was sort of shocked after teaching, about the Soviet Union. I didn't think one has to just praise what are called достижения, but I also thought that one had to think about what had actually happened in the 100 years or the 70 years after the revolution. And so I asked him, well, let's think about this. What about the victory over fascism? The Soviets, after all, took on 3/4 of the Nazi forces, as well as Allied Finns, Romanians, Hungarians, and others. The Soviet Red Army liberated Auschwitz and other death camps in the east of Europe, essentially bringing the Holocaust to an end. Ironically, I would say, it was the Soviet Union that saved the world for democracy and capitalism. You have to ask yourself, what about industrialization of a vast present country? What about changing a land of 80% peasants to 80% urban dwellers? Very costly. But it seemed to me, in the West particularly, it's been a custom to sort of denigrate all of those things that followed the Soviet Union. So without apologies, without neglecting the horrors that happened at the same time, it seems to you need this kind of nuanced, complex picture to follow any talk about the Russian Revolution.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Really, no words. Quite a set of remarkable and brilliant comments from all of you. I really appreciate that. We don't really have much time. We have 5 minutes, 6 minutes. Is there time for a question? What do you think? Is there time for a question? One question? All right.
Microphone, please. Will the person use the microphone, please? Please use the microphone.
Didn't really hear what you had. Wait.
Okay.
Он готов? Да, спасибо, я смогу повторить. Спасибо за помощь.
Thank you indeed. Here's my question. Well, one of the experts mentioned that a revolution should end one day and then government should begin instead. So could you name a few dates, like within 5-year periods, so when government superseded revolution in Russia? Thank you.
That everybody has their own interpretation of the revolution, and that moment of transition from the utopian moment of hope that everything's possible and the more practical feeling that now we have to get down to work, that can be interpreted as taking place at a number of times. I don't think there is one sort of right answer to that question.
Question 2. Yes? No, loudly. Yeah, right.
Konstantin Morozov from Higgs.
I'm Konstantin Morozov from RUNEPA. I have a question for Mr. Dr. Kotkin. Your concept of this cyclical lack of hope, hopelessness. Well, obviously, it has a grain of reason and much wisdom, and it probably works for all three modernization, the Tsarist Russia, Soviet and post-Soviet Russia. Having said that, what are the reasons, what are the roots of this cyclical nature of history in Russia? And so, what were the chances of breaking that vicious circle of hopelessness? And what can actually help us break this vicious circle? In a couple of words, please.
Thank you for your question. I didn't expect to be speaking again. So what I meant was not that there's hopelessness. There are a couple of options. Option could be that the capacities finally are as good as the aspirations, so that Russia is able to realize this mission of being the greatest country. You can judge for yourself how likely that might be. I don't comment. Another possibility is to relinquish the desire to be a special country with a special mission apart. So, for example, join the EU or whatever you can imagine. That's also a possibility. Third possibility, I didn't think it was that funny, but then again, unintended consequences of history. A third and final possibility for the purposes of this conversation is, of course, that the West crashes. The West collapses, and maybe even now China collapses, and then Russia is fine. There's no gap.
Well, Stephen, that was remarkable. You are a Jean Provocateur. Yeah, that was great. Either China will collapse or the West will collapse, and if that's so, we'll be in a bliss. Or to relinquish our mission like Moscow is the third Rome. Well, someone mentioned of the fourth Rome in Washington, D.C. Look, well, I have enjoyed this discussion. It was most interesting, most captivating. So history is full of unexpected eventualities. They just called me and said me that my grandson has just been born. So look, life has no end, and so they already given him a name, Nicholas, not in the honor of Nicholas the Emperor, but Saint Nicholas. And well, the final thing that I wanted to mention, our attitude towards our own history and the Soviet era. In the early 90s, people spoke in very derogatory terms about the Soviet era, and everything happened under Soviet Union, that we need to forget our past and move towards the European Union and move the path of the European Union. And so people were not very keen on studying the Soviet history. Now, I believe that remarkable international researchers who are working very closely on restoring the history of Stalin and revolution contribute a lot to our understanding of what revolution brought about eventually. I believe that the revolution ended in 1922 with the appearance of a new state, and Stalin's regime was also a direct consequence of the revolution. Having said that, we need to keep on with our research, and I believe that the centennial anniversary is giving us another nudge in that direction. And, well, I'm not sure about the bicentennial anniversary of revolution, whether it will give us another impetus. I still believe that this is a worthy subject for research. Thank you so much.